I'm very excited to be joined today by Brian from Delta G. He is the Chief Strategy Officer for the company. Now we have had your founder and CEO, Professor Karen Clark, on the show before, on our podcast before. So for our audience, she's been on the show twice. Just 2 hours of great content talking about the Delta G ketone ester. If you have any questions about ketones, fueling with ketones, I encourage you, go listen to those 2 podcast episodes. And on the first time she joined our show, she kind of gave us the origin story, the background story of the ketone and how it was developed. She was the Oxford University professor who kind of created this whole science. So just in short, for folks that aren't going to go listen to that podcast, what is the origin story of Delta G and of ketones?
Yeah, so that was actually what drew me to the company, was this history, along with of course, the potential of the technology. But in short, Professor Karen Clark, like you mentioned, she was a professor, or is a professor at Oxford, in physiological biochemistry. She started studying ketones in the 90s with the late Dr. Richard Veach, who was really the father of ketones. He studied under Sir Hans Krebs, so that's what the Krebs cycle is named after. And their research on ketones, like I mentioned, started in the early 90s, and then it carried over into the early 2000s, and they got wind of a program at DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Department of Defense. Really what that is, it's really the venture capital arm of the Department of Defense. So they invest in emerging technologies that will help the United States from a defense perspective. So they were early investments in the internet, in drones, GPS, things like that.
Wow.
So DARPA had a program.
All the cool stuff, all the really cool stuff.
Yeah, all the cool stuff, exactly. But DARPA had a program at the time in the early 2000s called metabolic dominance. So they were looking for a fuel source that could help fuel soldiers on the battlefield. They found that when soldiers were on the battlefield for extended periods of time, they were losing a lot of cognitive acuity and physical capabilities. So Veach and Professor Clark presented their research on ketones to DARPA, and DARPA granted them $10 million to create what is now Delta G. And it took them a couple of years, but that was in 2005. And so wow. They've had a ton of time, of course, to gather a ton of data and do a lot of research on the actual technology. And at the time, this is a really fun stat. I think it was even just like 8 years ago, what you would see like a 25-gram shot of Delta G costs around $3,000 to show you how much better it's gotten. Yeah, and one more thing I'll add to the origin story. It was still kind of under the radar, but there was a lot of Olympic athletes in the UK using the product without really anybody knowing, and they did very, very well. Yeah, which is kind of fun.
So it's funny you mentioned the anecdote about metabolic dominance. We met up with you guys in Kona and got to see you on the Big Islands for Ironman World Championships last year, and you were handing out these really cool T-shirts. You're wearing one right now. I keep one actually right here behind me on our set, just out of my love for you guys. And so on the back, it says metabolic dominance, and it has the equation that is Delta G. So what does metabolic dominance mean? Like, what is that?
Yeah, it came from that DARPA program. We just felt it was such a cool slogan that we just want to continue to use it because it does bring us back to our origin story, and the formula that you see under is the Gibbs free energy formula, which is really why Delta G is named Delta G. It increases the amount of free energy in your body. So we have connections to each part of the formula within the company.
You and I are going to work together. We're going to do a series on just covering every kind of corner of using ketones as a triathlete in your training, in your racing, in your recovery. And today, where I want to start, we could go 30 minutes today, but we're going to do kind of bite-sized chunks over the next few months here on the show. So where I want to start is with covering the most frequently asked questions I see athletes asking about ketone esters, about Delta G. And question number one, Brian, is what is this? When I drink this bottle, when I put this in my body while I'm training, while I'm racing, what is this actually doing for my body?
Yeah. So it's a good way to think about ketones, and I would say delta G specifically, is as a fourth macronutrient. So you have your fat, protein, carbohydrates, and then you have ketones. So now we can actually just drink/eat ketones. When before the delta G technology, we would have to rely on the body to create ketones from fat. So now we can really enter these metabolic states that were previously impossible, where we can have ample amounts of glucose available while at the same time having ample amounts of ketones available. When prior to delta G, you would have to deplete a lot of your glucose or glycogen in order to produce your own ketones. So you're really just giving your body this, in our eyes, a superior fuel source to provide your heart, your muscles, but I would say most importantly, your brain. So it's just a really clean, efficient energy source that you provide in your body.
Now, there are a lot of products on the market that promise to do X, Y, and Z for the athlete. Some of them are backed by research. Some of them are anecdotal evidence at best. Delta G is one of those products that has a tremendous amount of research pointing to its effectiveness. And so that's a
Mm-hmm.
question I often get from athletes is, okay, it costs what it costs. It claims to do what it claims to do. How do I know this actually works? So Brian, what's the evidence? What have you guys found in your research?
I would say two things. Number one, who's using the product, I would say is pretty big. So I would say we probably have inroads with every Tour de France team at this point, and a ton of the professional Ironman athletes. And they don't tend to waste money on products that don't work.
Yeah, sure.
And I would say that as far as professional athletes go, they know more about nutrition than any other, because the sport is so reliant on nutrition. It's
Yeah.
such an important factor. So that's number one. Then number two, these aren't all endurance performance studies, but I think we have 55 published studies at this point. I think we have around 25 ongoing, and that's just because of how much time we've had. But also, if you're a researcher and you want to study the effects of ketones, it's very difficult to keep participants on a ketogenic diet or fasting. So you really need the most effective way of achieving deep ketosis states without having to do that. And there is no other product in the world that can do that outside of Delta G.
Okay, all right. The next FAQ, especially once athletes try it for the first time, why, Brian? Why oh why does it taste the way that it tastes? It's not great.
No.
It's a shot you gotta down. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's not even like something you can. It's not even like an acquired taste. It's pretty bad. But
Yeah.
it is, yeah, for whatever reason. So what our molecule is it's beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the ketone body that you can produce endogenously, but we provide it exogenously. And that's the most important ketone body for energy and as a
Okay.
signaling mechanism. But so we combine what we call BHB, so beta hydroxybutyrate, to really our delivery mechanism, which is R13-butane diol. The reason it's called a ketone ester is because an ester is an oxygen bond. We bind BHB to 1,3-butane diol. So R13-butane diol is really the delivery mechanism to increase the amount of beta hydroxybutyrate you can take safely. For whatever reason, beta hydroxybutyrate, it's an acid and it just tastes really, really bitter when you create it through precision fermentation, which is how we do it. So I wish I knew why it tasted like it does, but yeah, I think, and we're, like I said, we're still young, so we're still learning about how to really flavor it correctly.
Okay.
We're actually we're coming out with new flavors now, or updated flavors,
Oh, hey.
updated flavor profiles. Yeah, for our flavored products, but which I think will really help a lot. But I think it's only going to get better. We're only going to get better at figuring out how to make it much more palatable over time.
Yeah. So next FAQ. I get asked all the time, Brian, why is it so expensive? And
Mhm.
to your point, back in the day, it was $3,000 for a little bottle, and so that's definitely come down as you've figured out how to produce it better and better and better. But for the athlete, I mean, if you're buying this for race day, if you're buying a couple 3 packs like this to practice, using it before race day, it's not the cheapest nutrition supplement, that's for sure. And so I often get, why is it so expensive? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's such a novel technology, and the manufacturing is still very new. The type of manufacturing, it's called transesterification, which is really linking those two hard materials that I mentioned. It requires a special machine, and like I said, it's still a very new process. So luckily, there are avenues to make it a lot cheaper, that we're going to explore as we grow. So luckily right now is the most expensive it'll ever be. And it is our firm thesis that within 5 years, we'll be able to get the price down and hopefully the education up to where almost everybody will be taking ketones every day. It'll become quite obvious
That's
to be
awesome.
doing so. Yeah.
There are other ketone products on the market that
Hmm.
claim to do what you are doing, and some are ketone salts. And on our own podcast, Dr. Krista Austin has already debunked for us ketone salts do not do what the ketone ester does. So
Hmm.
just talk to us very quickly on, if someone Googles these kinds of products, they're going to see Delta G, they're going to see a couple other things.
Hmm.
What distinguishes Delta G in the marketplace from so-called competitors?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, when you're taking an exogenous ketone, the goal should be to increase your blood ketone levels to ergogenic or optimal levels safely and effectively. That's like, put simply, full stop. There is no other molecule that can do that, full stop, outside of delta G. So we sell a ketone ester, like I explained before. It's an ester bond of the ketone and then our delivery mechanism. There is ketone salts, which a really cheap way of delivering beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, is to bind it to a salt. So you can make it very cheaply and you can make it taste good. But the problem is that, let's say in the best case scenario, you're going to have 1 gram of ketone and then 1 gram of a salt. 1 gram of ketone is not very much. It's not going to do really much of anything. That's probably the average serving size. So in order to get up to those levels, you'd have to take, let's say, 10 grams of the serving, so 10 grams of BHB, which would mean you're taking 10 grams of whatever salt combination they have, so 10,000 milligrams of whatever it is you're taking. Definitely not really feasible for almost
Yeah,
everybody. And then you have this other, not even new, they claim it's new, it's not a new category, which is R13-butane-diol, just straight R13-butane-diol. I presume who you're talking about is HVMN. They sell this
yes,
Ketone
that's the
IQ
one.
product.
Yeah.
I'll say this, 95% at least, I would say more than that maybe, of the positive exogenous ketone studies that have been done are delta G studies.
That's not initiated by you guys. That is people doing studies on ketones are coming to you to use yours.
We don't
Yeah.
sponsor studies. Yeah, we don't need to. Um, Almost, I think every single study that they reference is a delta G study. And so
Wow.
if you're taking, really what it is R13-butane-diol, what they use is straight R13-butane-diol, is an alcoholic ketogenic precursor. So it's like a high-powered MCT oil. We use it in our ester as a delivery mechanism, as a way to increase the amount of ketones you're taking at one time. So if you were to take Ketone IQ, whatever, 10 grams, 20 grams, I'd be surprised if you even broke 1.0 in terms of blood ketone levels, which is a very, very low level. And if you look at every study that's been done on exogenous ketones for endurance performance, you're getting up to 2.5 or 3 millimolar. So there are certain levels that you really have to achieve to see benefits, and no other product can do that. And I encourage anybody to test any product with their blood ketones and to see what kind of impact it has. None will even compare